Hello and welcome again to this series of training videos on measuring performance in the public sector. In this, which is the fifth in the series of videos, we're going to look at inputs and input performance indicators. My name is Mark Robinson and these videos are brought to you by the European Union. Inputs are the resources used by organisations to produce outputs. This includes the labour input of their staff and contractuals. It includes the supplies and materials that are used, whether this is utilities such as electricity and water, whether in the case of the police it's uniforms, whether in the case of teaching it's school books. Physical assets which are used to deliver services are also inputs. And that refers to the buildings, the office and other equipment, vehicles and the like. And finally, we can say that the funds that are used to finance all of this can also be regarded as inputs. Input indicators have an important role to play in management. So let's take some examples of input indicators, starting with those that relate to the human labour input, in other words, workforce indicators. One useful indicator can be a measure of the job vacancy rate. In other words, the percentage of positions that remain unfilled. Another useful type of indicator can be the measure of the percentage of your staff who have relevant education or training. Staff morale indicators can be important, particularly in organisations which really depend upon active staff engagement to produce a good service. And here, for example, a useful indicator is a turnover indicator, the percentage of your staff who are voluntarily leaving the job during the year, or a staff satisfaction indicator based on surveys of what the staff think of their management and the job. Turning from workforce indicators to other types of indicators, we have examples such as a measure of office space per ministry employee, a measure of the number of cars per employee on average, or in a school context, a measure of school classrooms per school-aged child. This leads us to an important general point about the use of input indicators. And that is that these indicators are mainly useful for internal management purposes. In other words, they're useful for the leadership of ministries and agencies to monitor and manage internal performance. By contrast, input indicators are generally not appropriate for external performance reporting. In other words, when the ministry reports its performance to the public, to the political leadership, or in the budget. And in this context, it becomes very important not to confuse input indicators with either output or outcome indicators. Unfortunately, it's not at all difficult to find examples where ministries have confused input indicators with either output or outcome indicators. And let me just point to a couple of real-world examples. Firstly, of so-called output indicators, which are in fact input indicators, such as the Agriculture Ministry, which uses as a so-called output indicator the number of new agricultural extension workers recruited. Well, your labour force are inputs, not outputs. Another ministry uses the percentage of personnel recruited and trained. Well, this is interesting because, again, recruiting personnel is about inputs. Training them, on the other hand, is an activity, so this is a combined input and activity indicator. Amongst so-called outcome indicators, which are really input indicators, we find, for example, the Education Ministry using the percentage of vacant teaching posts filled. Again, this is about your labour force. We find a number of other ministries using the budget absorption rate. In other words, the percentage of their allocated budget which they've managed to spend during the year. Once again, money is an input. It's not an outcome and it's not even an output. And then as a final example, another ministry which uses as a so-called outcome indicator the proportion of annually planned equipment which has been acquired. In other words, if it plans to purchase 200 items of equipment during the year, but only manages to purchase 100, this indicator would have a value of 0.5. Clearly, once again, equipment is an input, and this is an input indicator, not an outcome indicator. Well, that brings us to the end of this session, during which our focus has been on inputs, which are the resources that we use to carry out activities and to deliver outputs, and which include our personnel, the equipment and other assets that we use, and the money that we use to finance our operations and deliver services to the public. We've talked about the importance of input performance indicators for management purposes, but we've emphasized once again that when it comes to external performance reporting, what's really important are outcome and output performance indicators.